Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Monday, May 22nd meeting of the Science, Technology, and Energy Committee. As usual, we'll begin by all rising and joining Representative McGee as she leads us in the pledge. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Alrighty, welcome to one of our final meetings, maybe not our absolute final meeting for the session, but the session year, but certainly one of our last meetings. We have a presentation this morning by the Policy Research Shop at Dartmouth College. Looking forward to that. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to talk to the committee about a couple of other things. Number one, we're going to have three House bills returned from the Senate with amendments. Those three bills are House Bill 233, which is a thermal rec bill, House Bill 281, which was the repeal of the least cost integrated resource plan statute, and House Bill 139, which originally was a municipal group host net metering bill. All three of those bills were amended by the Senate. And all three of those bills, I'm going to encourage that the committee concur with the Senate amendments. In the first of those bills, HB 233, all the Senate did was change a couple of words to clarify that the Department of Energy needs to approve new methodologies for determining the validity of thermal rec requests. That's a simple change, a logical change. I think we should just concur. The other two bills are more complicated. HB 281, which was the repeal of least cost integrated resource planning. The Senate made significant changes to that bill. They added four other bills, three other House bills, and a portion of another House bill to that bill. So it's a mini omnibus bill now, and it includes the municipal group net metering, host group net metering change that was made by HB 139, removing municipal boundaries. It also adds about 8 pages of House Bill 609, which was the reform of the Site Evaluation Committee. House Bill 609, as you will recall, changed the the Site Evaluation Committee from being a standalone committee to being part of the Public Utilities Commission. Well, what the Senate did is they looked at that bill and they extracted what they thought were the most important components of the bill without going all the way to the transfer of the responsibilities to the PUC. And they incorporated those 8 pages of reforms of the existing Site Evaluation Committee into House Bill 281. In addition to that, they added the text of House Bill 251, which was a bill that Representative Thomas filed to require that the December electric bill show a dollar figure for compliance, for an individual person's compliance with the Renewable Portfolio Standard. And then the final piece was they added the substance of House Bill 622, a bill we retained, which repeals the Easy Board. So those are the 5 changes they made to HB 281, and I recommend that we concur with that bill. And before we go on to the last bill, I'll recognize Rendy Thomas for a question.
Thank you. Just want to clarify that it was Representative Douglas Thomas that did.
Yes, okay, I'm
251.
sorry, I forgot to clarify on that. And then the final bill that was changed by the,
Go ahead.
or did you want to say
You might as well
something?
finish. On 281, yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to ask, what is the process for us to officially agree whether we're going to concur or not? Do we, because we've certainly been discussing the variety of changes that are in HB 281 in terms of, positive law versus stuff we would prefer not to see in law. So what would be the process for that?
So that we're undergoing that process right now. We want to discuss it here in committee, but ultimately the decision rests with the committee chair.
Okay, so if we have a disagreeing opinion, then we
You can
get
express it and
in-house. Okay,
either here or on the House floor. Yeah.
okay, thanks.
And let's see, was there one other, did I discuss? No, I didn't discuss HB 139. HB 139, which was the elimination of municipal boundaries in the municipal group host net metering bill, was replaced in its entirety because that text has now been added to HB 281. It was replaced in its entirety by the text of an amendment that Representative Summers had prepared during our discussions of Senate Bill 167. That was the hydrogen bill, which we ultimately rejected, but the Senate really wants to get a definition of green hydrogen into statute because the Senate believes, and they have convinced me, that we need to have that definition in statute in order to qualify for federal dollars. Apparently, there are quite a few federal dollars that are available. But if you don't have that definition in statute, it hurts your chances to qualify for some of those federal dollars. So they replaced the text of 139 with the text of Senate Bill 167, minus any references to tax credits or other subsidies for hydrogen projects going forward. And so I'm going to recommend that we concur on that bill as well. But I'm welcome to hear any discussion on any of these bills from the folks assembled here this morning. Yes, Representative McGee.
I think when we were discussing 281, I didn't think I heard you say there's also the dissolution of the Easy Board, which is another
Yes,
factor there.
I mentioned that.
Did you?
Yes.
Okay, so I guess most people here are not all that familiar with what the Easy Board is or does, but we did have a meeting of the Easy Board on Friday that we were both at, where folks were both shocked and dismayed at the idea of that work being stopped. I guess I won't say stymied because it'll be completely stopped. So is it appropriate for us to have a conversation about how we feel about that bill?
Yes, we can talk about that, but I'm going to suggest that we wait until after our presentation because I don't
Sure.
want to hold these folks from Dartmouth up too much longer. But
Great.
if you want to have a conversation about that, we can do that.
Terrific, thank you.
So now let's turn our attention to a presentation that the Policy Research Shop at Dartmouth asked me if I wanted them to do any research for us back in the fall. And I said, yes, you could look into the question of whether biomass electricity can be generated in New Hampshire or New England without subsidies. And so they have done that, and they have a presentation here for us this morning. So I'd like to turn the floor over to Mehak Batra and Beatrice Capio so that they can tell us what they've discovered. And welcome to you both. Appreciate you coming down, making the trek from Hanover down here this morning. Thankfully, the weather was good. Hope you had a pleasant ride. And we'll probably ask you some questions as you go along, but we'll look forward to hearing your presentation. So take it away. Thank you.
Chairman Vose, members of the committee, I am pleased to join you today in Concord alongside my colleague Beatrice Capio. My name is Mehak Batra, and the two of us are researchers at the Class of 1964 Policy Research Shop from the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center at Dartmouth College.
The Policy Research Shop produces nonpartisan policy analyses, and we present our findings today in a non-advocacy manner. Today, we'll be presenting on biomass, electricity generation, and capacity in New Hampshire, which is the subject of a recent report that has been circulated to the committee by the center and my colleagues. We are here to present the facts on this important issue today. We will begin with an overview of biomass before discussing our research design and findings. We'll look forward to your questions, barring any immediate needs, at the end of the presentation we have prepared.
To start off, biomass refers to any plant or plant-derived material that can be converted into energy. This includes not only wood, but also agricultural residues, municipal solid waste, and gas extracted from landfills. These products can be burned into produce heat that powers electric generators or processed into biofuels for transportation applications. Today, we will be focusing on wood-related biomass electricity generation due to the extensive forests and solid tonnage of wood-related biomass resources, as depicted here in New Hampshire.
It is worth noting that, while widely considered a renewable energy source, the sustainability of biomass in practice is somewhat debated. Drawing on the context of where we're coming from the Upper Valley, Professor Andrew Friedland from Dartmouth authored a recent opinion column in the Valley News about the hidden costs of wood-fired and wood biomass. Not too long after, Professor Ben Steele of Colby Sawyer College responded, noting that plants have found ways to manage emissions and arguing that biomass is an important element of an electrical generation mix. Our report, in part, seeks to situate the viability of biomass among other renewable options.
Lastly, biomass has historically not been price competitive with other electricity sources, motivating the generation of our report and research question. Are subsidies required for biomass electricity generation in New Hampshire? Which asks whether subsidies are required for biomass electricity generation in New Hampshire. In constructing this report, the research team spoke with a range of experts. The team spoke with Professors Mark Laser and Andrew Friedland from Dartmouth. We consulted individuals from the McNeil Power Plant in Vermont and Bridgewater Power Plant in New Hampshire. And we also spoke with individuals from stakeholder groups in the logging industry, natural resources consulting, and from the neighboring state governments.
The report takes a two-pronged approach to considering this problem. First, the report compares biomass to other sources of renewable and non-renewable energy, especially natural gas. Second, the report draws on findings from case studies in neighboring Maine and Vermont to consider how New Hampshire is faring, relatively speaking, on biomass generation and broader renewable energy commitments.
In the report, we compare biomass among other electricity sources when it comes to the construction and maintenance for biomass-related infrastructure. We conclude, to understand fully if biomass is economically viable, we first compare biomass to other energy sources. It's first important to compare the fuel costs of other sources, both non-renewable and renewable, to determine how they compare to biomass. In the field of energy production, fuel costs are often the greatest expense for power plants, and the fluctuations in price of feedstock can significantly influence the cost of electricity being produced. In New Hampshire, the average price of wood for biomass electricity generation is $18.50 to $32 per ton. Dry wood is produced by stacking freshly cut lumber for a few years before burning it in order to decrease its moisture content. Usually, 1 ton of wood is expected to generate 1 megawatt of electricity. Natural gas in New Hampshire usually costs $7.64 per 1,000 cubic feet. Producing 1 megawatt of electricity requires the combustion of 7,600,000 cubic feet. Producing 1 megawatt of electricity requires the combustion of 7,600 cubic feet of natural gas. The data in Table 2 from the EIA, right here, shows that the biomass electricity has slightly lower fuel costs than natural gas. It takes, like I said before, $18.50 to $32 of wood to produce 1 megawatt of electricity, whereas for natural gas, it's required to produce the same megawatt hour, which would cost around $58.
We also demonstrate that wood chip prices, as seen here, are highly variable year to year and do not reflect the full story of the biomass generation cost. Thus, relative comparisons with other energy sources are more useful from an economic analysis standpoint than purely centering wood, or the fuel for this form of electricity cost, as you can see in this table.
In the report, we also compare biomass among other electricity sources when it comes to the construction and maintenance required for biomass-related infrastructure. We conclude that biomass construction and maintenance costs are significantly higher compared to other sources of electricity when considering their relative output. Further, we considered how the price of electricity has changed per megawatt over time. We see that the market price rarely reaches or exceeds the subsidy price considered and set under SB 365, which was a previous subsidy put in place in New Hampshire. Thus, prior New Hampshire subsidy levels did not adequately or thoroughly affect the biomass generation market and broader energy generation landscape in the state. Furthermore, National Financial Advisory and Asset Management firm Lazard assessed the nationalized levelized cost of energy for renewable and conventional energy sources without subsidies and found that the only specific forms of renewable energy, i.e. solar and wind, resources are cost competitive with fossil fuels. This was a figure from the report and was also included in the New Hampshire's 10-year energy strategy report released in 2022. In that same analysis, there was discussion about how traditionally subsidized renewable sources like biomass cannot maintain competitiveness in regional electricity markets without state intervention. The report mentions that several biomass facilities have recently shut down or suspended their operations. ISO New England, New England's nonprofit regional transmission organization, only projects 8 megawatts coming from biomass facilities based on the ISO New England generator interconnection queue in February 2021.
Entering our case studies portion of the report, we first turn to our neighbors in Vermont. The report highlights the McNeil Generating Station. The plant's net operating costs, including transportation, for the past 2 fiscal years have ranged between $91 and $101 per megawatt hour. A representative from the plant talked about their positive relationship with state leadership and the necessity of subsidies at the federal and state levels to support fair pricing, like through a tax credit program. Next, we look at Maine. Lisa Smith from the Governor's Energy Office described that the cost of operating Maine's biomass generation plants exceeded revenues per year by around $1 to $2 million in the past couple of years. Talking with Eric Kingsley from Innovative Resource Solutions, we further learned that biomass plants are required to sell their electricity at around 5 cents per kilowatt hour, and that plants must buy their fuel at less than $10.08 per ton in order to break even. Thus, Kingsley and Smith underlined the need for policy intervention in order to support the viability of biomass as a renewable source of electricity in Maine, and described the need for a related course of action in New Hampshire.
Moreover, all 3 of these states share a similar climate, high forest cover, population density, and energy demand. But what separates them is the renewable energy standards and state assistance that they offer energy providers. All 3 states also have unique class distinctions for their renewable energy standards. To start off, New Hampshire's Renewable Portfolio Standard has a requirement for its electricity providers to obtain renewable energy credits or certificates, RECs, equivalent to 25.2% of retail electricity sold to end customers by 2025. Of that total, 8% falls under the Class 3 distinction. The total Class 1 RPS obligation will be 15% by 2025, which is new renewable energy sources. Following the establishment of Renewable Portfolio Standard, New Hampshire's SB 51, enacted in June 2017, established a committee to study subsidies for energy projects. The studies of this bill are referenced throughout the paper, such as the study on the economic viability of Renewable Portfolio Standard Class 3 biomass electric generation resources in New Hampshire, and found that high and consistent subsidies for the biomass industry would be needed to work with New Hampshire's portfolio standard. This low renewable portfolio energy standard has deterred the biomass industry from taking off. On the other hand, Vermont's renewable energy standard does not have any distinctions for when a facility began operations. Even though the state has much higher standard, requiring 55% of its energy to come from renewable sources in 2017, their system allows for flexibility in Vermont's RPS. Similarly, Maine has high standards. It requires 80% of its electricity to be supplied by renewable sources by 2030. Maine requires that 30% of its load must be satisfied by renewable electricity generation in 2019 under Class 2, and 10% must be satisfied by new renewable sources under Class 1, and an increasing number of amounts of renewable energy under Class 1A and thermal renewable energy credits. Thus, both states have higher standards for renewable energy production. Because both Vermont and Maine require such a high portion of their energy portfolio come from renewable sources, and biomass is in excess because of high forest cover in the respective states, they facilitate a process for biomass with state assistance. These considerations could potentially point to why New Hampshire struggles with supporting biomass production and will continue to do so.
In summary, through this research, we first spoke with experts and stakeholders, developed 2 case studies, and reached out to biomass facilities. Then we considered the economic feasibility of biomass electricity in New Hampshire and the state's current renewable energy standards. And lastly, as my colleague just noted, we have concluded that subsidies and policy intervention are necessary for biomass to thrive in New Hampshire. As New Hampshire is committed to a renewable portfolio standard, the state may need to seek investment in alternative energy sources in order to generate electricity more cleanly and sustainably. With the state's vast forest resources, wood represents a possible alternative to traditional fossil fuels. However, adopting any new fuel source like wood in the state's energy portfolio generates questions of viability and cost. Next steps for this committee and broader research on renewable energy in New Hampshire could involve the study of the specific subsidy level required for biomass's viability in New Hampshire and the renewable energy standards in the state, as well as consideration of the relative viability of other non-biomass related renewable energy forms.
Thank you for your attention and time. We look forward to your questions on the research.
And thank you for an excellent presentation. We appreciated that. And I'm sure the committee has some questions for you. So who wants to go first? Anybody? Representative Bernardi will go first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, folks. So you've indicated that a subsidy is necessary. What are we looking at T-Rex, and what level of subsidy is, I guess, expected to be necessary to ensure biomass survives or thrives?
So obviously this was like out of our scope of research to look at what level of subsidy we looked at, but if you look at this graph right here for SB 365, the subsidy, the market pair price never really went above $50 except for the polar vortex of 2014. So we would expect if you were to do further research, it would be around that $50 amount. But of course, that would be a point of further research for you guys.
Thank you.
Additional questions? Representative Lewicki.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. One of the things I keep wondering about, I actually visited the Bridgewater plant, and the issue that I am concerned with is latent heat of vaporization of water. Basically, if you send water up the chimney, it's going to cost, you're not going to be producing energy efficiently. And if, even with dry wood, there's going to be some of that. And so have you thought about that at all?
I'll say that that was not the primary subject of this report, but certainly, further research could consider the efficiency of individual plants themselves, and how, for example, they differ with regard to, using dry wood and wet wood as you're describing.
Representative Wendy Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With regard to the case study in Vermont, you said that it receives federal and state subsidies. Did you break that down into percentage of each subsidy?
Sure. We did not specifically look at, breaking down individually and comparing the federal and state subsidies. What we can say is that, yeah, they didn't.
So when we talked to the McNeil generating plant, they did not receive any direct subsidies. What they did receive is a $5.16 million grant. In conjunction with several local organizations. This grant has just, I think, gone into effect this past year, and that you can look into. Several news sources have talked about it, and we can provide more information for you guys about this, but that is what they're working on right now. It's a huge federal grant has just gone into effect, and it was coordinated by Representative Patrick Leahy.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just add to that briefly. On page 9 of the report, if you have it in front of you, I believe it's been circulated to this committee. We also, at the McNeil plant, they described the federal renewable electricity production tax credit, for example. So there are various tax credit programs that this committee may want to look into on that point.
Let me clarify real quickly. The report has not been sent to all members of the committee yet. I plan to do that later today. I did not want to send it to them prior to your presentation because I didn't want to steal any of your thunder. But the full report will be made available to the committee shortly.
Wonderful. Well, we hope you all, get out not just from this presentation, but also from the full report. It also, I believe, is available on the Rockefeller Center's website under Policy Research Briefs.
Chair.
Representative Floget.
Thank you, Chairman. Along with the report, if you could ask if the testimony presented could be included with what we have here in hard copy.
Okay. Could you provide your written testimony to the committee as well?
Speaker notes? Yeah.
Yeah, we're more than
Yes, your notes, I
welcome
guess.
to
Yeah.
do so. Yes.
Chair,
Yeah.
Representative Floget?
follow up. I think electronically will be enough to save paper and all for, we don't need all the printouts just to confirm.
Yes, hard copy not required, just email will be fine.
We're more than happy to do so. I'll also refer the committee to the references section of the report itself, which I understand will be made available soon. It references, for example, as we've noted in the presentation, the various stakeholders that were interviewed. So if you're interested in perhaps corresponding with them directly, that would also be a good point of contact.
Okay, I have a question for you. You briefly mentioned in your presentation that there were a couple of op-eds written by Dartmouth professors about this question. Did you read those and could you briefly summarize those to us?
So, Professor Andrew Friedland, we first talked to him and then he talked in the Valley News. And he was one of the first people who discussed how biomass generation is not a viable source of electricity generation in New Hampshire. That was like the basic premise of his argument. And from there, we went off and did our research. And the next thing we mentioned was from Ben Steele, who's from a Kobe Sawyer College. He's actually not a Dartmouth professor. And he responded to Professor Friedland and basically said the opposite. And that was kind of what sparked our research and this debate. Whether is biomass sustainable? Is biomass economically viable? It kind of like spurred what we're kind of looking at as our crux of the argument. These 2 points, is it first economically viable, and 2, is it economically competitive? Like both of those things.
And both of those sources are mentioned in your references in the report?
And they're both also on the Valley News.
Great, okay.
Yeah. I'd refer the committee specifically to page 1 of the report that will be circulated, from my understanding, shortly, which references both professors and their their columns from Dartmouth and Colby Sawyer, respectively.
Great. Representative McGee has a question.
Thank you. And thank you for being here today. This is a well-done report. I appreciate the limited scope. I think it's very helpful for, levelized data and all that. It's very well done. My question is around, for follow-up. You were talking about there are many different aspects you could follow. But on the page with the, it wasn't this one. Yeah, it was the comparing fuel costs. I think we're always very concerned with that that aspect of cost. But when we had hearings on biomass in New Hampshire several years ago, we heard from industries that relied on or were compatible with the biomass plants that existed at the time. And there was conversation around sort of the cost benefit analysis of having economic stimulus in the energy sector that was in state versus sending dollars out of state. So I wonder if, in terms of the economics, any of the externalities beyond RPS compliance or other policy pieces that are put in place were considered in terms of the cost analysis.
Sure, we can describe a couple.
You're from Dartmouth, so we want to put you through the ringer.
Yeah, thank you. We can describe a couple, other components that went into kind of the economic viability angle of this. One of them was about job creation, and that's referenced throughout the report with regard to kind of the existing jobs in biomass in the state of New Hampshire. The other research that we did also looked a little bit at what those kind of, I don't want to say necessarily failing, but at least biomass plants that fall kind of down the less efficient end of the spectrum in New Hampshire. In those, I will say, kind of to your point about keeping resources in state, I believe a Maine company actually has at least been in kind of exercises to acquire those plants. So I'd say that that is another angle that we looked at. So both the jobs angle in the state of New Hampshire, as well as I was just referencing, ultimately where, these plants are and who owns and operates them, which appears to be trending out of state.
Representative Bernardi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Lewicki brought up the concept of ensuring that we have dry wood. It maximizes the efficiency of these plants. When you looked and discussed at the different plants, did you identify optimum ways of drying? Is it covered materials, out in the sun, chipped? What activity maximizes that benefit?
Sure, I would say that we didn't necessarily look directly into, how to optimize the wood drying process. What I will say is that, as our previous slides have shown, just generally the wood chip market tends to be quite variable year to year. So that can make it a little bit difficult to decipher between years and the relative efficiency at drying wood. Additionally, we looked a little bit at the plants themselves and compared them, especially among this like class 1, class 2, class 3 spectrum. And so hopefully that can provide a little bit of an angle, but we didn't necessarily look at this idea of optimal wood drying, I suppose.
Thank you.
Representative Notter has a question.
Nodder.
That's what I said. didn't I?
Okay, I didn't hear it right. I was just thinking back a couple of terms ago. I think we had an all-day hearing, and we had different people representing businesses that benefit from biomass. Like one was talking about how clearing the forests helps prevent forest fires. There was a woman who her business was to collect the ash, and they used it as fertilizer. And I wondered if these other businesses were taken into consideration when you researched your report and the cost benefit ratio.
So we reached out to as many organizations as possible. We reached out to the logging industry, different types of stakeholders. Most of them did not respond. We also reached out to the New Hampshire Department of Energy to ask for more stakeholders. And they gave us some names. Most of them were not able to get back to us in time for this report to be released. But we did try to get the most type of reach we could to answer the question as best we could.
I'd also just add to that briefly. Obviously, there's a equilibrium amount of forest cover that is appropriate in the state. So with regard to, the use of those resources, we need to make sure that whatever solution is implemented or way that biomass and other forms of electricity that rely on, for example, wood resources, that whatever that is ultimately ends up being renewable. That whatever solutions you all are debating and end up considering, that they ultimately meet that kind of renewable idea where we're not, using too much of something that we can't get again. Forests are resilient, but we need to ensure that we're not necessarily relying on them in such a way that we're not diversifying the electrical generation mix. And I would also note, just as a general point, that the type of wood that's used in wood biomass generation is not, pristine lumber. It tends to be various kinds of, we're talking about wood chips, but lower grade wood. And I would say that the report itself, which will be circulated soon, does a pretty good job of explaining the types of wood that are used and kind of how they fit in, especially with the lumber industry here.
Representative Noel has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for taking my questions, for a very good presentation. I was wondering if you've given any consideration to alternative uses for the biomass fuel? Were there other considerations given there, and is this the best use that can be made of that fuel?
That's a great question. I would say that with regard to the actual fuel used to generate biomass energy and relatedly electricity, certainly, the timber, for example, that is used, the wood chips that are used, from our understanding, are not particularly useful in other contexts, given that they're of this lower grade, lower quality. I will also say that I think the report considers, for example, where exactly this wood is coming from, and concludes that, for example, we probably could not be using the wood to put together these wonderful desks in this room today, and thus are probably pretty useful in biomass generation in the kind of current context. I will also say that biomass generally, as the report goes into in more depth, can be used for more than just electricity. A lot of it happens to be used for example, industrial heating, even just heating in people's homes, transportation. There are more, uses for biomass energy itself than just, creating the current that we use to charge our computers, for example.
Representative Corman has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here. And I just want to follow up on Representative Noel's question. So I'm imagining a world where we just don't even have the capability to use biomass to generate electricity or heat. There are these trees. Some of them are useful, some are not. The ones that are not, that are harvested, what could happen to them then? What would the chips just pile up somewhere and rot and maybe catch fire? I mean, any ideas what the alternatives are to using this wood for biomass?
I'll direct you, when you have the report in front of you, to page 2, which goes into, again, what I've been describing as low grade wood, as well as what is described as waste wood. And I would say that, I'm sorry, but I am not entirely sure about, the proportion of low grade wood to waste wood that goes into the biomass fuel pool, but certainly waste wood, things like, wood that comes out of processing facilities, or, that is procured from sawmills, as we go into briefly, probably would not be particularly useful in other contexts. But I will say that further research can consider that question more in depth.
Representative Partial has a question.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your presentation. Would not a lot of that wood thus remain in the wood lots and not be harvested to begin with if there was not a use for it? To follow up on Representative Corman's question.
Just gonna make sure I understand the question. Would the wood not be out there in
The
the
waste
forest?
wood that's we're using to fuel these biomass plants, if there was no market for it, the foresters would not be going to harvest it to begin with, is what I understand.
Perhaps, good question. Again, the report didn't directly look into, where this waste wood or low grade wood could go beyond biomass generation. I'll be clear on that. I will say that I think that the report makes clear, though, for example, some options for example, more efficient plants that may use the wood in a slightly different way.
Follow up?
I guess a follow-up to that question would be, is that a side benefit to biomass would be ensuring that there is a market for the waste wood so that we do have forests that are well managed. It helps to pay for the well management of our forests. No?
Yeah, like a way you can look at the biomass industry is that like there's this wood that is undesirable, as in like low grade wood, and the biomass industry is basically a byproduct of it.
Sorry, could I proceed? One of the other benefits that we read about within the context of biomass energy generation in New Hampshire specifically is also that New Hampshire's kind of logging industry is relatively traditional compared to what's going on in other states, meaning that a lot of it is, the timber that you see on the highways and hope it doesn't fall through your windshield when you're driving to work or school every day. And so one of the benefits of biomass, or I will just say broader, more alternative, forms of use for this wood, is that it would kind of revitalize, for example, the logging industry. And to your point, we're not 100% sure based on this report, where that wood may go elsewhere. But one of the perks of biomass electricity generation is that it kind of steers at least part of the existing industry in the state away from more traditional forms of production. That makes sense.
I also want to add one more. And it also just helps generally with forest management. I did read an article where it said that like forest fires and other like bushfires and things like that are managed because of this byproduct of the biomass industry.
There is a legislatively established commission that is looking into this question of alternative uses for biomass. It's been in operation for at least a year, and I'm not sure when its first report is due, but they have been making progress in coming up with some alternative uses for biomass. Representative McGee has a question.
Thank you. Thanks for taking my question again. This is kind of a two-parter. When we were having those hearings, I heard from a constituent who owned a large tract of land. And his concern was that the value of the land that many of the people who own the forests in the state would be devalued by the fact that the low-grade timber no longer had value, which was helping him pay his taxes and that kind of thing. So I just thought that was an interesting angle, because it could very much mean that some people will not be able to hold on to their properties and they will be sold to the highest bidder outside the state. So the change in the whole traditional ecosystem around the harvesting of the low-grade timber, I think, is a question that for thinking about, because it is back to economics, right? How is it viable? How are we using it? Is it being used locally? And is there even an economics to getting it from point A to point B, so that when it gets to that factory and they have to pay for that transport and that logging, does it all get rolled into the price at a feasible price, right? So that's the first point I wanted to make. But the second thing is, you were talking also about how there were better and worse run plants. And I know we heard testimony from our Department of Environmental Services that they were allowing plants to be considered renewable in terms of RECs or TRECs based upon what they had been doing to make sure that any emissions coming from the plant had been cleaned up to a certain degree. So when you say better or worse or whatever labels you used, can you describe for us if there is any difference as far as you know in terms of how renewable plants are these days? Because my understanding is the technology has improved, but I really don't know a lot about it.
Yeah, I think the first distinction that you can make, and the distinctions will be made clear in the report, is between first class 1 and class 3 biomass plants. Class 1 biomass plants are new renewable energy plants. They started operation after like January 2006, and they first have higher efficiency rates than class 3 biomass plants and are going to be your most renewable and clean biomass plants. Class 3 biomass plants, which there are not many of left anymore, are going to be less efficient and are going to be the ones that are a little bit poorer in terms of outputting and of having this renewable aspect to them. They also are the ones I guess we're trying to focus on today in terms of looking at like costs and looking at whether they're like need subsidies, because they are the ones unfortunately struggling.
And I'm sure that the previous testimony noted and explicated a little bit more in depth than we have today exactly what efficiency means with regard to electricity generation and broader energy generation. But when we look at biomass power right now, it's estimated that the efficiency of plants is about 25 to 30%. And this compares to, for example, nuclear energy power, which is roughly 50% of New Hampshire's electricity, as I'm sure you all are aware, and is about 34 to 36% efficient. I'm reading from page 2, and you all have the report in front of you. And the newer nuclear plants, for example, can be up to 39% efficient. So hopefully that gives you a sense of kind of the trajectory generally among different forms of electricity with regard to their efficiency and how that is progressing as newer technology is available. I will also note that one of the difficulties when we talk about this distinction between class 1 and class 3 plants is that it's not particularly straightforward, as you may imagine, to create a new plant, or in some ways, I don't believe it's right now possible to convert a plant from like a class 3 plant to a class 1 plant. And as our previous slide showed, for example, on the left, we see the average construction cost of different plants for different forms of energy generation. And we see that essentially the payoff for biomass isn't particularly comparable to what's going on with other forms of electricity, essentially underlining that biomass plants are really expensive to make, and their actual efficiency, even when they are good and we're investing a lot in them, you know, it's still pretty high for what we get out.
Representative Lewicki has another question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure whether it's a question, a comment, or what, but I think in terms of looking at efficiency, the whole system efficiency would seem to have to be included. A nuclear plant has very few transportation costs, but if you start adding in transportation costs and so forth for biomass, coal, whatever, it would seem that that would be a substantial variable.
Yes, and we've tried to minimize kind of the math you will have to do in reading the report with regard to what, for example, those transportation costs you're describing, especially with regard to a comparison to nuclear power. For example, with regard to the Vermont numbers, if we look at the McNeil plant, these net operating costs, for example, we're discussing are inclusive of transportation, for example. So hopefully that can better help the committee and you, for example, in determining exactly, you know, a fairer comparison among other sources. But certainly a concern.
But I do want to note for nuclear, which is also included in your 10-year strategy report that was released, I think, this past year, is that it does have this zero carbon aspect to it, which makes it and it is a little bit more cost competitive compared to biomass, which makes it, I think, a more viable source of energy at this point.
Representative Noel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The hard question that we as a committee have to answer is, does the state of New Hampshire want to continue subsidizing biomass? Have you looked into this enough to form an opinion on that?
Sure. Well, I'll reiterate to the committee that we're here in a non-advocacy manner. So we're just describing, how New Hampshire is faring relative to, our neighbors in Maine and Vermont. And I would say that two kind of possible paths of action were determined in creating this report. One is that there could be some version of a more direct, I'm not going to say direct because that has connotations, but a more direct form of subsidization for the plants themselves in the state of New Hampshire. And the other, as my colleague kind of alluded to toward the end, is that the actual renewable energy standards could be shifted in a way that would change the electrical generation mix and potentially support, further subsidies for biomass plants. So we're not here today to necessarily provide you with a subsidy level that makes sense. I know we described a little bit, within the context of the subsidy level under SB 365, which of course is rather contentious from my understanding here. But hopefully the report gives a sense of, future paths of action, either directly or indirectly out of this committee and out of this House and government, and, can help at least provide a little bit of a bigger picture about what's going on elsewhere.
Representative Corman has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you again. So going back to what we were just talking about, the construction cost, I'm struck by the cost for biomass being twice as much as anything else except solar, where it's almost twice as much. And, I think about solar, which of course uses a lot of land. What accounts for the very high construction cost of a biomass plant?
That is an excellent question. And I will say that the report, again, did not look directly into the mechanics of individual biomass plants. But certainly we can see that the, cost comparison demonstrates that biomass is pretty expensive when it comes to creating a new plant. The reason I will say that explains part of, frankly, not spending all too much time researching on that question is that we are looking specifically at the existing biomass plants and not necessarily the construction of new ones in this context. But certainly if the state is in the long term interested in investing in the construction of new plants, cost would be a bigger issue there.
Also, heating infrastructure makes the cost of the plant become really high.
Yeah, the actual process of producing electricity based on from biomass is pretty technical. We've got to have the boiler, we've got to be burning something, and of course, making that boiler work, which spins the turbine, which goes to generator. It's quite involved compared to some of these other sources. For example, if we just think of what a wind turbine looks like, for example, the infrastructure just looks pretty different. Does that answer your question?
Okay, I have a question for you. The levelized cost of energy slide. Could you tell us where you got your levelized cost of energy for each of these categories? And did it include the cost to back up intermittent generation?
So I don't believe it included the cost to back up intermittent generation, first off. And this is a national number, so these are not New Hampshire specific. This is from the wealth management and national financial advisory firm Lazard. And this is the same graph that was included in your 10-year New Hampshire energy strategy report released last year. And it's just to show that wind and solar is the only unsubsidized are the only cost competitive renewable energy sources that are competitive with conventional sources such as natural gas and in some cases coal. So that is what it wanted to show. I understand that the figure is a little bit complicated, but at the baseline, that is all I wanted to show with this figure.
And to underline again, this is an unsubsidized analysis to begin with. So hopefully that gives the committee a pretty good sense of kind of where these sources of energy fare in comparison to one another without subsidies or anything like that. And further, I'll just note on the intermittent, for example, note that you were describing, one of the things we were looking at is, for example, with regard to coal, we know that coal can be used in the state of New Hampshire if it's particularly high demand season, for example. And just to kind of underline this point that this is a national analysis, not everywhere is going to have the kind of polar vortexes that we see here that cause, for example, that big spike if we go back to the subsidy graph here. So it depends across the country where you're looking at. Every state also has different resources, different infrastructure, for example, but that we see nationally, generally speaking, in that levelized analysis, how different forms of energy compare.
Representative Floget.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your research and your presentation. I do understand page 3, you were focused on one item of, is there subsidies economical for wood, bio? In your research, as we found out in research, have you found any other lines you did not go on because that was not part of your charge, such as many of the other generators have subsidies also? We didn't look into, can they survive? Did you notice where we could have gone with a research, a tangent, if I could say, of the rate of return to New Hampshire's ratepayers and taxpayers on subsidies? You know, like you heard mention, the logging industry, the tourists, upgrading our force. Is there another report out there? Thank you.
Yeah, there were a lot of different directions we could have gone with our research. In terms of rate of return for ratepayers, there was a report that we did reference a lot in our research and did look at a lot in our research, and that was a report released in 2018 by New Hampshire itself. It's the report on economic viability of Class 3 biomass facilities, and that found that the rate of return, the cost of for ratepayers for subsidies was $3 million from 2014 to 2017 for this SB 365 and other subsidies. And of course, there was a lot of different analysis that report did. It's a 52-page report. I think that would be a really insightful report to look at if you guys were to do further research on doing another subsidy and which level of subsidy you would like to do on Class 3 and Class 1 biomass facilities in the future. But in terms of doing further research, there were a lot of different directions we could go. Of course, we were limited in scope and the people who responded to us. But yeah.
We also know that there's a great deal of research, as you all have alluded to, with regard to study on this issue in the state, both from, for example, policy researchers like ourselves, but also within the state. My colleague referenced, for example, this report from 2018 in December from the New Hampshire Office of Strategic Initiatives. This was a study on the economic viability of specifically those Class 3 plants, which is referenced throughout the report, and I would recommend. And hopefully this presentation and report that we have put together can inspire, as my colleague alluded to, some further research, both both, externally and also within, for example, the Office of Strategic Initiatives and other entities within the state.
Yes, having read that 2018 report by Matthew Mayu, I can highly recommend it. Excellent report. Any further questions from the committee? Well, seeing none, I want to thank you both for a wonderful presentation and a very informative report, which the committee will have in its hands shortly. And if we have questions, could we ask you via email for additional information?
Yes, you're more than welcome to contact, the names listed on the report, as well as our own names listed on the slides today. And I am sure the center could get you all in touch with us directly as well. And I will also reference the Policy Research Shop website for general information about these types of analyses, and also, again, the brief if you're interested in seeing it before it becomes available over email later today.
Wonderful. And I'd also like to thank Michael Wales for setting, who I guess you're the director of the Policy Research Shop. Is that correct?
I'm not. I'm a faculty member.
Faculty mentor. Okay. Well, whatever your role, we appreciate you performing it and helping us out with arranging for this report and for coming here this morning to present it to us. We thank you, all of you.
Of course. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. So before we wrap up our activity this morning, I know Representative McGee, you wanted to discuss a little bit about the amendments to House Bill 281. This is specifically research the amendment regarding the repeal of the EZ Board.
Yes, I think the points that I wanted to make are, it sometimes it's referred to as a Christmas tree bill, right? A number of different bills get attached, or an omnibus, or a quasi-omnibus, or a half omnibus. And what ends up happening is there are bills that you would like to see advance and bills that you really would oppose. And I think that's the case for myself on 281. I think there's been a lot of discussion around how the least cost integrated resource planning process needed revamping for current circumstances. But as I mentioned in the hearing on this bill in the Senate, we just passed Senate Bill 54, allowing the utilities to enter into long-term purchase power agreements. And that creates a situation that's very similar to the reason that the least cost integrated resource planning was put in place in the first place, to protect people from long-term stranded costs for capital investments or investments that are larger being entered into by the utilities. So I see it being not wise for us to say, let's eliminate least cost integrated resource planning before we've decided what it is that should replace it, especially at a time when we're allowing large term contracts to go forward, which could ultimately put the ratepayer on the hook. So that's, and I personally feel as though the EZ Board is in the midst of doing a bunch of really useful work, which was illustrated by the wonderful presentation we had on Friday from one of our members. And so that too is something I disagree with. And finally, I'll just say, I don't think including HB 251's language is useful in any way. No one was asking for it. It will confuse people, in my opinion. And it's also something that the ratepayers will have to pay for in terms of a change on the utility bill. And that change is not based on the user's actual charges, but rather an aggregate mean of charges on an estimated bill. And so I think it just confuses the issue further of what's being charged to people in terms of renewable portfolio standards. And so I am pretty much opposed to that bill as well. So that's 3 out of 5 things on there that I don't think I could vote for. And that's as quick as I could say it.
So would it be your opinion then that we should non-concur with the Senate amendment?
That would be my recommendation. I know it's not popular with, the folks that are sending it to us from the Senate, but that would be my recommendation.
Any further discussion on this issue? Representative Gorman?
Thank you. And there's also the issue of the site evaluation committee, and I did notice that what the amendment from the Senate does is it seems to streamline parts of the process. That's a good thing. But of course, we did retain HB 609 in committee. And it seems to me that if we're really thinking about what we want to do about the site evaluation committee, we should be looking at it all together rather than piece by piece. So I would rather us really look at what to do with 609 and think about how we should be revamping not just the processes, but possibly the membership as the bill originally submitted did, rather than just doing it piecemeal.
Well, since we retain that bill, we can still do that. Even if House Bill 281 passes and makes some adjustments and changes to the existing site evaluation committee, we can still use House Bill 609 to make additional changes if we deem them to be worthy of making. So it doesn't preclude further work on reforms to the site evaluation committee.
And I understand that. I'm just thinking it's best to look at the whole thing at once together rather than piece by piece. But I do agree that the changes that the Senate has recommended will at least streamline the process.
Further discussion. Representative Bernardi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, as the sponsor of the bill to repeal the Easy Board, I'm totally in favor of the of that portion of 281. I would only comment on the December electric bill adder that will explain RPS costs. When we went through that bill, it was made clear that there would be no additional costs to consumers to include that. So I'm again in favor of that. The improvements to the site evaluation commission, I favor those improvements. I also agree that maybe we can take a broader and larger examination of the entirety of the process. But if we don't get there, we've at least moved forward on that front. The only thing that concerns me at all in the bill is what they've done with the municipal boundaries and what that means for potential shifting of costs to ratepayers. So in aggregate, I would be in favor of moving forward with 281.
Representative McGee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'd like to thank my colleague, Representative Bernardi, for bringing up the fact that in the hearing, we were told there would be no costs for adding that information on the December bill. But the bill language, in fact, says that costs incurred will be allowed to be charged back to the ratepayer. So the bill language actually says that they will be charged for those changes, because I don't know when that was included, but it was my understanding as well in the hearing that it would not cost anything, but the language of the bill does not state that. It states that the costs will be charged to the ratepayer.
That is protective language. It's fairly standard language in bills. Yes, it is there. You're right. Any further discussion? Sorry there is such limited attendance here this morning. We couldn't have a full and robust discussion of this issue, but people have lives and other things they have to do, and jobs, yeah. So, all right. Well, that wraps up and concludes then our activity for this morning. I want to thank everybody for being here, and I guess we won't see you again in committee until sometime in June. Representative Thomas, who also isn't here because I believe he's in the building, but I believe he's with the Londonderry fourth graders. And he's still trying to set up a trip up to the Burgess Bio power plant and possibly the Q hydrogen plant up in the North Country. I don't know how that's going. He's not here to report on it, but that probably will be the next time we'll see each other as a committee. And beyond that, we'll see each other in Reps Hall on June 8th. Yes, please.
The last question is just a logistical question around the retained bills and when we're going to discuss how we're, I don't know if you have names of people for all of them or how we're working that so that we get them on the schedule for the fall or start talking about when that will happen.
That's an excellent question. I'm glad you brought it up. I'm actually going to spend some time this week looking at the retained bills and trying to decide if there are any we can discuss before the end of June. And if there are, I will schedule one more committee meeting and I'll be discussing that with you. So we'll see what we can come up with. Anything else? Okay, thanks everybody. See you next time.